Hello, Global Theater. My name is Gerry Fialka. Today is January 5, 2024. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Greg Biermann. Where in the heck you calling in from, Greg?
I'm calling in from Weehawken, New Jersey.
How cool is that? The first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
You like that question? Well, that seems to be a question that has some parts missing. Maybe that's intentional, right? Because the first thing that comes to my mind is for what?
Or
The
what?
best for what? Right.
Well, no, that you start off, you win, Greg, because the point of this series is to invent new questions. So you're like the Irish, they answer questions with a question.
All right, I'll take
for,
that.
for what? We could go on because everything comes with a full circle. What's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
Well, I guess I'm what you call a visual thinker. So my favorite form would probably be in images.
Yeah.
Most of my thinking has been about that. Um, but so I'm gonna go with since it has to do with images. I'm gonna go with moving images, which is has the temporal element that makes images move.
Why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Yeah, the basic questions seem like they're the hardest ones to answer, right? Like I always ask my students things like, "What is art?" and they always, struggle with things like that. And I think you're giving me things that are along those lines that impossible to answer, especially in an impromptu situation. But
Well, here's one thing to keep in mind. You don't have to answer the question. They're just prompts to jump off. And when I asked my mom, "Can I interview you?" She says, "Everything I say today, I might change tomorrow." So I'm not holding you to it. It's just sort of like jumping off points to talk. So yeah, it's
sure,
not. Yeah, I mean, it's yeah. Then some of my questions at the beginning are, is it more this or more that? It doesn't. Of course, it depends on the context, and it's both, and blah blah blah. So I mean, yeah, whatever you want to say is fine.
yeah. Well, I think information is important, but certainly, and collecting it's important, but also organizing it's important, and being able to retrieve it's important for any purpose, right?
Yeah,
So, information in itself can be interesting, knowledge in itself can be important, but and I think that's true, and I think it's something that's lost in uh, thinking about education these days. That just knowledge it within itself is important, but also how to use it is also important.
yeah.
Right? And so that's another matter entirely.
Well, you're touching on a lot of what we're going to get into, but do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate or more invented?
Innate in humans, yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's one of the things that makes people human.
yeah,
What makes humans human.
yeah. Do thoughts create emotions?
Sure.
Yeah,
I mean, do a thought experiment, right? You can play with yourself that way. You think about something that uh, is disturbing or upsetting, and or something that's joyful, and suddenly you're feeling something.
yeah.
So, you know, certainly without thought, difficult to have a pure emotion that's untethered to anything. I suppose that's possible, but
Yeah, it just resonates with my friend told me in the New York Magazine interview with Marina Abramovich a couple weeks ago. She says, I'm really obsessed with Matisse right now because he was painting flowers during the war and everybody was painting the horrors of war. So if everybody across the world right now started painting flowers or singing songs about flowers, could we stop war? You know, it is a big thing. It's like, can we stop this all of a sudden after all these years? So, can we manifest, our thoughts into the emotions that we want, you know?
Right. Well, when you bring in art into it, you're bringing art, talking about Matisse, um, whether or not art has the kind of effect in the world that some artists and thinkers imagine, that it can stop wars and transform society and create new ways of living. There's reason to doubt that art has all of these abilities that have been bestowed on it. And then, to say that art's important because it can do these things about transforming society, uh, gets in the way of thinking that art is important within itself, without having to do anything.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. There's a lot going on there. Greg, fill in the blank. I don't know what I think until I.
I don't know that I can fill in that blank. Uh, yeah, I don't know that I can fill that blank in.
That's fine. Can humans think without language?
There we're getting into a philosophical issue, aren't we? About what thinking is, defining what thinking is, and uh, then determine, from there, you can start thinking about whether or not the question of language. Um, I would say that it's possible to have an image in your mind. Whether or not that's thinking goes to the definition of thought, right?
Yeah.
And so, as a visual artist, someone who thinks about images or thinks in images, my definition of thought would include things like sounds, images, experiences, and so forth. But if your definition is strict, about concepts, uh, and think, and that thought involves words, then that has various consequences, right? Then, since non-speaking animals don't have words in their minds, then they can't think, right? And so, uh, it's complicated.
Yeah, it's funny. You anticipated the next question almost word for word. I appreciate it. You must have ESP. Chomsky says a language is not just words, it's culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is. What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
Well, maybe there's some advantage at times when language breaks down, because it may be that the structures of language have some ways of creating where we're going to go in our thoughts, and it may be that we may discover things that are interesting, um, you know, outside of language. I mean, that was an experimental film. For example, there's this whole issue that Brackage brought up on metaphors on vision, right? Where the idea is that if you don't have the word green, then don't, you're not limited to in what you perceive in grass to one idea, one color. That there are millions of colors there, and I think some experimental filmmakers, sort of try to embody that idea in their work. Like Nick Dorsey, I would say, is a filmmaker who does that. Um, that the image uh, kind of falls outside of a linguistic description of that image, and impresses itself upon the mind of the viewer in a way that might slip through a kind of net of linguistic thinking, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Actually, it's touching on a lot of what we're going to go into once we get to film, but a few more of these. Um, your observations of humans in general, are we more thinking or more feeling beings?
Well, if you're talking about, determining how we behave, I would say definitely feeling, right? That our behavior is often motivated by how we feel, and sometimes to our detriment, right? Because we're not
Yeah.
thinking through uh, what might happen to us in the future, or even other people in the future. If you care about other people, right?
Yeah.
What was the Groucho Marx line? What have future generations ever done for us?
I never got that one. I need that one for my what what what's the verb? What have?
Yeah.
That is a good one. Ever done for us. So very good, because there's a bumper sticker on a car on my street. It says, "Don't believe everything you think," and it's almost you could substitute, "Don't believe everything you feel."
Hmm.
Could be either way. So these are two questions from Alan Turing, 1950s. Is thinking a function of the soul?
Again, you're getting into philosophical and religious territory there, right? Is there a soul? If there is, where is it? What is it? Uh, you know, does it die with the body when the body dies? You know, these kinds of things. So um, that's a complicated set of things there. I don't know that I'm prepared for that. But in
That's
any
fine.
case,
Yeah, it's like Rebecca Solnit said, just because I a question is asked doesn't mean I have to answer it. Saying I don't know or I can't answer that is totally fine. I'm not trying to put you on the spot. This is fine. We got a million of them. So the second Turing question is, can machines think?
again, we're getting into these semantic things about whether or not we can define thought, and what that is. I mean, I've been playing around with Midjourney and uh, some of these artificial intelligence uh, image making tools. I haven't necessarily come up with anything that I would show to anybody else, but or the idea that it's even me doing it. I mean, it hasn't come up with collaborating with my prompts with anything that I think is terribly fascinating. But the fact that it does what it does is sort of fascinating. Is it
Yeah,
evidence? Is it evidence of a machine thinking? I don't know, but it seems to me that the future is heading that way.
yeah. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Well, assuming those two things are separate, it may be that you become happier when you feel like you're uh, doing something significant, or you're involved with something significant, or that you find some significance in it, right?
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, the meaning's another complicated thing, right?
yeah,
You know, uh, the meaning of life, for example. I can't remember which philosopher wrote this, but they're saying, the question, what is the meaning of life, is the same as trying to say, what is the smell of geometry? It
yeah,
is a, it is a question, right? But, it's a question linguistically. It's a question in words that fits grammatical, it's grammatically correct, but it's not
yeah,
a question. It's not a question that makes any sense.
yeah. But it's I got it from Viktor Frankl's book Man's Search for Meaning. He says meaning tends to last and happiness doesn't necessarily last. So again, it's more or less, Lily Tomlin says reality is just a collective hunch. It's just like we have a kind of collective hunch of what a lot of these words kind of mean. So that's what I'm totally accepting on what you're saying, but it's sort of like I'm after your hunch or your guess, which is fine. Does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're more so detecting it or more so creating it?
Well, my hunch, if you want my hunch, is that it is a byproduct of the brain.
Yeah.
Yeah. That that uh, we are understanding, that something's in front of us. I'm understanding that I'm through some kind of machine talking to another human being, communicating. That's conscious, right? Uh, and without brains, we don't have it. It's not like it's there,
Yeah.
uh, and I'm tapping into it somehow through having a brain.
It's funny because Jean Rouge said if I put something between me and you like a camera, it's more real than if there's no camera there, which is interesting. Having used Zoom for the last 3 years, I find my interviews a lot more present from the two people, me and the person, than if we were live in a room. And McLuhan said the great line is said, technology is the most human thing.
Uh-huh. Well, yeah. I mean, not that other animals don't use tools, but
Yeah,
we are certainly much more into it than
yeah.
chimpanzees are.
What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
I would say that the speed that you're measuring in both of those things are different. Although since thought is made from electrical impulses, which are maybe traveling. I don't know how fast do electrical impulses travel in the brain? Are they traveling at the speed of light? I don't know, but certainly my thinking is slower than the speed of light. If you're talking about it in poetic sense.
This is
Otherwise,
good.
otherwise I'd be able to answer all your questions more immediately without having to think about them.
No worries. It's like there's no rush here. And I love the anti-speed commercial Frank Zappa did years ago. He says, "Don't do speed; it'll turn you into your parents." And again, it's putting in you put them into the context, whether it's poetic or literal. This is Audre Lorde, the poet, saying you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tool. Yvonne Rainer responded, said, you can if you expose the tool. What new tool do you suggest?
Wow. It's funny. I was thinking about something like that today, recently, when I was telling somebody about showing an image from Birth of a Nation to a class, and talking about how when I learned a lot about, let's say, the classical Hollywood style, we'd look at something like Griffith's work without talking at all about the social context of his work and the
Yeah,
historical situation in his work, particularly with that film, in which the KKK are glorified and so forth. And the question I gave to the class was, if the classical Hollywood style comes out of this racist film, then is it somehow automatically corrupt? Its way of working, is it automatically kind of corrupt? And the same idea with Audre Lorde, like the idea that, or sort of a reverse idea, that if you're working in a style with language that is undermining the uh, kind of status quo stylistically, then that means that it'll also be politically undermining somehow,
yeah,
revolutionary politically. I don't necessarily agree with that. Actually, I think what postmodern era has shown is that, in fact, just because you're stylistically radical or something like that, whatever that means these days, does not mean that you're going to overthrow the government.
yeah. Heavy duty. You'd be opening up a can of worms there because They asked Guido Pontecorvo, who made Battle of Algiers, what does your film do to people? And he says, teaches them how to make a film. And so, Bush used it as a training film, and the Black Panthers use it as a training film. So right there, it sort of disproves that thing you said about, does the classic Hollywood movie automatically corrupt because it was founded in capitalistic society. In fact, I asked Craig Baldwin once, cinemas as an art form has been swindled by capitalism. I read that in the LA Times. I says, what do you think? He goes, yeah, and it's our job to swindle it back. And I that sounds good, but you don't want to become your enemy, do you? Why would you want to swindle it back? Why don't you reinvent something new? But bringing up Birth of a Nation, what a heavy film. I highly suggest you get this film, that a book that just came out called Cinema Ann Arbor. Have you seen this hardcover book? It's really heavy. And so, this guy showed Birth of a Nation 50 years ago on the campus at U of M, and he got fired, or they protested. And then 50 years later, or just a half a year ago, a film teacher got fired for showing Birth of a Nation. Literally
Right.
lost his job.
And a music
But
teacher also who showed Othello,
with Wells,
what's that?
Wells.
No, the one with uh,
Anyways,
yeah.
he
Anyway,
showed what happened. He showed Othello in.
and Othello's in blackface.
Yeah.
And was lost his job essentially because he didn't properly contextualize it before he showed it, or something along those lines, and it didn't allow a safe space for the students. This kind of thing, and I always like to say that my classroom isn't a safe space. It's the only way to learn something, is to be a little bit unsafe.
Allow a safe space. You gave me a lot to talk about. The other thing about bringing up Birth of a Nation is that, I don't know how true this is, but it's been said and read that the KKK learned how to burn crosses from the movie.
Well, and it rejuvenated the KKK, right?
Yeah.
A second or another wave of KKK activity was a direct result of that film.
Yeah.
And so, if you're going to show that film and simply talk about, well, look how he cuts on action, and or look how there's two lines of action happening at the same time and cross cutting in between them, and so forth, without addressing that, as Spike Lee talked about when he went to film school at NYU, that the instructor did something like that. There's a problem.
Yeah, but the key words for me that you said was direct result. That's like Kubrick pulled Clockwork for 30 years from UK screens only, because the UK cops came to him and said, or police said, dude, you've got to pull this film because it's causing kids to beat up winos. Now, here's my question to you. Did Kubrick pull it because he really thought his film was directly causing, like you said, was causing the kids? Or did he go, wow, what a good PR thing? Because if it's only pulled from UK screens, it doesn't matter. And the kids are going to go buy bootleg VHS copies on the streets of London anyways. Mm-hmm. So what do you think? Kubrick pulled it as a PR stunt, or because he really believed his film was causing kids to beat up winos?
I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, that would be something that Kubrick would have to be asked, I guess, if that were possible. Yeah.
In this very chair, I asked James Harris, who made 8 films with them, and he said, nope, Kubrick believed that 2 things, family and film. And he says he was scared they were going to come beat up his family. That doesn't mean it's true, because I think Kubrick was probably knowing films can't do diddly squat, as Sidney Lumet says, but it ain't going to keep me from trying.
Yeah, I mean,
And
I don't. It's not that I don't think films can do things. I think they can,
yeah,
but I think probably the extent to which they are going to change the mind, corrupt the minds of the youth or something like that because they watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, they're going to
yeah,
chop people up with a chainsaw, is overstated by a certain conservative element in society that likes to be able to uh, make trouble for artists.
yeah, and also it's scientific revolution saying we can prove causality. You can't prove causality. You can say I've studied the patterns and it's likely this helped contribute. The kids were wearing those boulder hats and dressing up like droogies, but did the film cause them to beat up? No, it's probably their upbringing and their whatever. There's many causes,
Right, right.
and so that was the tool question. What new toy do you suggest?
Well, I'll put it this way, and maybe this is changing the question a little bit, but when I'm thinking about the idea of the avant-garde, right, as something in which you can break new ground, you're overthrowing the past, or any kind of idea of the avant-garde that deals in ideas of progress, which seems a little silly these days. But I think the only way in which that might still be true is in kind of formal, uh, innovation. And in formal innovation, you're linked to your tools very directly. And so, uh, with digital technologies, it allows for things now that you couldn't do before,
Yeah.
or were so difficult to do that they would become impossible for an individual artist to do. In which case, I would say that you know digital tools are the way forward in thinking about innovation in form.
Yeah.
So it's somewhat limited what I'm saying here.
No, it's a fine answer. It's good. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Well, I've had a major health issue recently, um, and so something that's always in the back of my mind is not waking up.
Yeah.
Um, what happened was I had something called sudden cardiac death, in which my heart started to have an arrhythmia, and it was very sudden. There was no, I had no problems before that, no health issues of any consequence before that. And if there wasn't a person who was a nurse who was just happened to be there, who did CPR on me, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. Uh,
Wow.
so so yeah, I woke up 3 days later in a hospital after being in a coma, and had no idea what had happened. And so since that happened, it's in some ways life is simpler.
Dude, I hope the best for you, man. And so McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions. So we might learn how to cope with what we don't like about our inventions. So, Greg, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
You mean, why do sort of the general public ignore them?
Yeah, you can put it in the context you want. When I say us, I mean us, artists, us, the normal people, or, I don't mean to divide and conquer. I mean, yeah, everybody kinds of ignores it, but if you think, well, artists don't ignore the hidden psychic effects of other artists, that's fine too. I mean, however you want to put it in the context, but there's some people who ignore these hidden psychic effects, even though the artists are telling us something more. Sort of like
Yeah.
when the German official went in and saw Guernica being painted in Picasso's studio. And he pointed at it and he goes, "Did you do this?" And Picasso goes, "No, you did."
Well, so what I would say there is, let's say, just linked to cinema, right? Thinking about
Yeah,
cinema.
yeah,
Um, I always say to students that a lot of what cinema does is invisible to people,
yeah,
but despite the fact that it's right there on the screen, most people aren't aware of it. Case in point, let's say I showed a film and I talked about the rectangle of the screen, which I did once,
yeah,
um, to community college students, and uh, they couldn't understand that what they'd been looking at for the last 2 hours was a rectangle of light. They were very much happy to talk about what was going on in the film in terms of
right.
character development,
Yeah,
or in terms of narrative, what the details of the narrative were, and maybe even discuss the meanings or interpretations they had of that narrative. But they didn't understand anything about the rectangle of the screen. And
yeah.
so, one of the things I always think about is, if so much of what cinema is doing is invisible, then that's a problem, because it opens you up to being manipulated, mostly for commercial reasons, sometimes for political reasons, by a pretty powerful medium.
Duh. It's
Right. And so I think
130
part of it,
years of cinema is 130 years of propagating warfare to us.
and so I would say that understanding what it's doing and how it's doing it is central to becoming kind of conscious of the ways in which it can be used to manipulate us, or the ways in which it does manipulate us. And that's part of media education, right? That's central to why it's important to study film.
Well put. It's like, guess who invented the film festival?
Who invented the film festival?
Mussolini.
Is that right?
Oh yeah, and he also invented dubbing films because he didn't want people to read the shit. He wanted to dub the shit so it could tell the. I mean, there's a heavy film on subtitling that really breaks it down. But it's also what McLuhan was there at Fordham showing films and talking about film, just what you were doing, and he showed a film at once, or no, he brought up that an anthropologist went to Africa and showed films to these people, and there's a character in the middle of the screen doing something, and all the people who watched the film went, there's a chicken that ran through in the back, and they went, where'd that chicken go? They didn't care about the protagonist in the middle of the film, let alone that this whole thing about the structure of aspect ratio, huge thing, and just like you're staring at a screen that so do artists have moral obligation?
As much as any human being does.
Yeah,
I don't know that they have more of a moral obligation than anybody else.
yeah.
Uh, yeah. I mean, but to say that they have no moral obligation would be problematic.
Yeah. Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
Well, one of my students said to me recently, of the films of 2023, which did you think were the best? And I had to admit that I hadn't seen at that point. I have seen them now, but I hadn't seen Oppenheimer, and I hadn't seen Barbie, and I hadn't seen any of the mainstream movies that they were talking about, or wanted to talk about with me. And I said, it may be that that's because I'm an old man, and maybe I'm rummaging around in the back catalog because I think that there maybe is no need for any more movies. There's enough. But maybe that is an old man who is afraid of new ideas. I don't know. maybe maybe I'm becoming stiff.
I don't think you're missing much, but I tell them watch Day After Trinity. If you're going to watch Oppenheimer, make sure you watch Day After Trinity too. So I asked John Ellis just recently all these same questions. It is, and it's the same thing. His film was used by the good guys and the bad guys.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah. Once you create your art, it's no longer yours. They can use it however they want. So Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever, or one of them?
My earliest memory, um, I think it's a visual, actually. I do remember my mother sort of carrying me into a house and seeing the wallpaper on the wall, which had a kind of impasto white, I don't know, pattern of floral something on it that sort of visually impressed me somehow, and I always think about it. I think that's probably the earliest thing I can remember, and it was
Greg, it's
prior
amazing.
to uh, we were in Brooklyn um, at that time, and then later moved to Staten Island, and I think this was prior to uh, moving to Staten Island from Brooklyn.
Yeah. It's amazing how many people answer that question with a visual. That is the visual is the dominant in early memory. Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Well, since I've never been in a situation where I haven't had remembered anything, um, I can't answer that. But I would say that people who I remember there was a 60 Minutes about people who can remember absolutely everything. I think Mary
Yeah.
Lou Henner, the actress who was in
Yeah.
Taxi, the TV show,
Yeah.
was one of them. And one of the things that they experience is that since they remember everything in incredible detail, there are some great pluses with that, amazing abilities. But there's also great minuses that they
Yeah.
experience trauma, and that trauma is just fresh, 10 years from when they experienced it, as it was when it first happened. And so getting over these things for them is much more difficult than it is for us more forgetful people who, can't remember where we put our keys or whatever, what happened, what was the last book we read or the last movie we saw. When people ask me that, it often takes me a while to remember.
Yeah.
Even if I've spent, 50 hours with the book, I might not even remember it the next day.
Yeah. No, there's two great things you evoked, Greg. James Joyce said, "Remember to forget." And I follow that a little too literally. But
I
you know,
did.
I
I
I
did. By the way, I did hear you on NPR or something being interviewed about James Joyce's Ulysses
no,
uh,
Finnegan's Wake. Yeah.
recently. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, was it Finnegan's Wake? Finnegan's
Yeah.
Wake. Uh, so yeah, I just wanted to mention that since you
Yeah.
brought up James Joyce.
But it's funny because my dad lived till about 95, and he had some dementia or loss of memory at the end of his life, and I know it's probably in the DNA. So over the last couple of years, as I turned 70, I'm like, man, I know I'm losing it in some ways. So I went to the doctor and they did a test, and they said, "Nope, you're okay." And they said, "If you look at your keys and go, what are these for? Then you're losing it. If you forget where your keys are, that's normal."
Right. Right.
Tell me someone within your immediate family, then outside your immediate family, just briefly, who had an impact on you, kind of like a role model, and what specifically was that impact?
Well, obviously, if you're thinking about psychology, then your parents obviously are the people who have the most impact on you, or at least, you know, uh, certainly my parents, had an impact on me in ways that I probably don't even want to talk about or admit. But in any case, some of my attitudes probably either come from them or are, directly fighting against them,
Yeah.
their value system or their beliefs and so forth. Outside, I would say probably artists, and particularly artists that were important to me were Larry Gottheim and Ken Jacobs. These two people were, when I was young and impressionable, and taking classes in film and art in the 1980s in college, had a huge impact on me, both in their teaching and also just as examples of being able to do things. the idea that you could be an artist was maybe a little weird for me, and I became, a person who could accept the idea that I had something to say, and a perspective that might be interesting to explore through art.
Yeah, both Larry and Ken are amazing. I've been highly influenced by both, and I was lucky enough to interview Larry once, and it was amazing. He's really articulate. Did your parents raise you a particular religion?
My father was a Holocaust survivor. He was a German Jew, um, and after World War II, came to the United States at 13 years old. Um, Interestingly enough, he wasn't really practicing. You know, I didn't really grow up with religious feeling, uh, and although culturally, I would say my parents were definitely Jewish. I don't know that they, uh, were believers. Let's say in a supreme being or anything else like that. And I don't know that I am either. I don't, when I read any of the four horsemen, right? W- uh, Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins make a lot of sense to me in terms
Yeah,
of they're thinking about um, religion and God
yeah.
and things like that. And so I guess
Do
that's
you
what I would
pray?
say about that. What's
Do
it?
you pray? Do you pray?
No.
If God exists, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
Oh, and by the way, this is something that I experienced after I had this death experience. Because I was
Yeah,
legally dead for several minutes. I don't know how long it was.
yeah,
uh, and then I was in this coma for 3 days and sort of came out of it. And people asked me, I remember the nurse in the hospital in the ICU said, what was your experience? Did you see anything? Was there any God? Was there anything, did you have any religious feeling there? And I said, there was nothing. I mean, I really didn't experience anything.
right,
And then when I kind of came out of it, I was in this hallucinatory terrain, but I didn't experience it as a religious thing.
right,
I was just trying to get my bearings, and I had no idea where I was, and I was really hallucinating hard. Probably if I hadn't taken acid, I wouldn't have been able to survive that
compare it.
without.
Yeah,
What's that?
you
Yeah,
mean to compare it with something in your past
right.
experience?
And I said
Yeah,
to the nurse when I was hallucinating, um, if you tell me something is not there, then I'm going to believe you because it's clear to me that I'm not experiencing the world as it is here. I'm
yeah,
experiencing something else that's more in my brain trying to reboot itself. And so she said, some of these things that I thought were threatening me were not there, and I believed her. I said, okay,
wow,
I was able to accept that
yeah,
because of I had these other experiences previously. Um, but the idea that I would somehow have a religious experience when I was dead, sort of reminded me of this um, sequence in Herzog's film Caspar Hauser. Do you know that film?
I know it well. Yeah,
The Enigma of Caspar Hauser.
yeah,
When the priests come to him and they ask him when he was in the basement, he must have known that God was with him. Or at least that's what they wanted to hear from him. And he said, no, that I didn't have any concept of God. No one ever taught me anything about God. I didn't have any language. I
yeah.
was just in a dark basement on the floor, and the only thing I'd ever seen was this little wooden horse. Like that was it. That was my whole universe. Um, anyway, that's related
That's
to
a
my.
heavy image. Yeah, but I mean, if God does exist, what would you like Him to say to you after you die?
Well, I would say, how do you deal with the problem of theodicy? Right? Why is there evil in the world?
Dude, that is a great. Paul Krasner asked his guru that question. He says, "Why is there evil in the world?" He says, to thicken the plot.
Right, right, right.
But this again, you must have ESP because that is the next question. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Yeah, I would say evil people exist, but it's human. I don't think they're evil animals.
Yeah, it's human that everybody's capable of being evil. That's what most people say. It's amazing. But really, Greg, the hidden question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And I'll set it up. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurai, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. A basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
It's interesting. I mean, I was at a meditation session once, and there was a monk there who, the person running the meditation session was not a monk. He was a philosophy professor, but he was interested in Eastern religion. And somehow this monk showed up, a Buddhist monk showed up to the meditation session. And, after the meditation session, the philosophy professors asked if there was anything anybody wanted to say or something like that. And the monk said, I have a problem. And the philosophy professor said, well, what's the problem? And he said, I have hate in my heart. And the philosophy professor was sort of dumbfounded. He couldn't really respond to that. He didn't know how to deal with that. And I thought, that's the crux of the problem, isn't it? Right? I mean, that's where your enemies come from. That's why they're your enemies, because you have hate in your heart, right? And you talked about happiness and meaning, and I would imagine that a person who could free themselves from that would be uh, in better shape and have many fewer enemies. Doesn't mean that there aren't any enemies out there, but the idea that you're looking at your enemies as human beings, I think, is some way of getting out of that.
Is a key. It's amazing because I haven't brought this up in years, but I met a kid who was raised a Buddhist. I talked to him like at 10, and then I talked to him again at 14. I says, what have you learned being raised a Buddhist? And he says, not to hate. And I'm like, is hate culturally taught? Or is it, here it again morphs into the next question. Nassim Taleb said games were created to give non-heroes the illusion of winning. In real life, we don't know who wins or loses, but we can tell who a hero is. My friend said, well, villains don't think they're bad. They want control. Heroes want freedom. And here's where you resonated with what you just said was Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist, said, if the criminal gets caught, does he go, whoa, my criminal skills weren't up to snuff that day? Or does he go, I did something morally or socially wrong? So it's a lot of prompts. You can go wherever you want with all this, but the basic question is, does punishment work?
Yeah, well, uh, it depends on what you mean by work, right? If the threat of punishment prevents me from doing something that is outside of the bounds of what I'm supposed to be doing in some social situation, then it probably is working.
Yeah.
If on the other hand, there may be things that I have an imperative to do that are outside of what the law says I'm supposed to do, or what is acceptable in the mores of the society I'm in, that I'm just going to do anyway, regardless of the punishment, because the punishment is in the future anyway. And I may have a some people have a greater dislocation with their future self, which makes them get into more trouble because punishment doesn't mean anything to them.
Yeah. Yeah. I asked the guy who produced that Enron movie, Your film could be just a training film for up and coming capitalists because all they do is get a hand slap and put in a country club jail. And he goes, "Yeah, I guess so." So, I mean, it's funny. People often say that punishment, and I like that you actually analyze the verb I use because that's really what this is about, Greg, is me and you versus the wording on the questions. So I like it when people say, well, that verb doesn't quite work, or I would say this is a better verb, or, because you got nouns and verbs in these questions, and people sometimes just go for the nouns. And, we don't know how much punishment can or can't work, but we can sort of study patterns. And most people go, it works for the punisher, but not so much for the person being punished.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, in the Christian religion, right, we have a situation where there's a whole religion based on punishment, right? The cross is a symbol of punishment,
Yeah.
and so that's not strange that a Christian society would be kind of obsessed, and I think our society is a Christian society, basically, um, that would be obsessed uh, with punishing,
Yeah.
right? Which is why we have so many people in jail, why we're so, you know, the idea that we'll feel better if the killer of someone in our family is punished,
Yeah.
even though that's not going to bring in the family member back.
Yeah.
The idea of, and it works in the movies too. I mean, Dirty Harry. Why is that such a delicious thing for people? It's the idea of inflicting devastating damage on somebody who deserves it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, as Clint Eastwood said in Unforgiven to Gene Hackman's character when he says, "I was building a house. I was, just doing the best thing for my town. Uh, I don't deserve this." And Eastwood said, "Well, deserves got nothing to do with it."
Well, that's also my question I've asked for a few years. If Trump gets thrown in jail, he can't run for president. He writes a book and says, "I'm sorry, I did wrong." Would you forgive him?
Would I forgive Trump? No. But it doesn't
Nine,
matter. What I do with Trump doesn't matter. I
yeah,
mean, it doesn't require. He doesn't require or need my forgiveness.
yeah,
Um, you know, uh, my I'm not one of his people, so it's
yeah.
irrelevant what I think.
Well, James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, "This is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree?" Sort of like Larry Gottman's tree film. And so, years later, Faulkner said, "Sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism."
Mhm.
Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Yeah, I just finished. I was thinking about Herzog a lot because of just finishing the book that he wrote. In fact, I finished
His,
it today.
his
Uh,
latest book. You mean his latest book?
yeah,
Yeah,
it's Every Man for Himself and God Against All.
yeah,
Um, but in it, he talks about this issue also, about what the truth is. He obviously famously hated the people like Frederick Wiseman. Um,
oy vey.
like the fly on the wall.
Herzog wishes he could be as great as Herzog. No, as Wiseman, but I love Herzog and I love Wiseman. I don't.
I do
Yeah,
too. I think they're both great.
I've
But
had it out with Herzog several times, man. And anyways, keep going. I want to hear. So yeah, the direct
well,
cinema. Yeah, fly in the soup or fly on the wall. Yeah,
the idea, right? Or well, his metaphor was, I'd rather be a stinging hornet than a fly on the wall or something.
yeah,
Um, and the question is, documentary has always had this meditation on the truth. What is the way to get to the truth? This goes even the illustrated lectures of the Griersonian documentary was concerned with the truth, and
Yeah.
Grierson said, it had to do with spontaneous gesture on the screen.
Yeah.
And then if you move to the thinking that the direct cinema filmmakers like Wiseman were thinking about, they're trying to get to some kind of authenticity and some kind of truth. And so I think is um, is Herzog in his documentaries and his fiction
Yeah.
films too. And it may be that in some cases you can get to the truth through a kind of artifice, through a distancing, then a greater truth through mediation, through the mediation that a film provides. You may understand the tree better through looking at an image of it than you do in real life, looking at it, uh, without the boundaries of the art medium, or the film medium. And so those are all fascinating issues, and they,
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody like Wiseman or like Herzog has a totalizing view of what a good film is, or that sort of thing, um, and it results in good filmmaking, then I'm willing to forgive that totalizing view, even if I don't agree with
Yeah.
their way of looking at it entirely.
No, I know the whole thing on Herzog's ecstatic truth, emotional truth, blah blah blah. Werner's a great filmmaker, but he also pays people to do stuff in his documentaries.
Uh-huh.
So, go do this and I'll pay you. Well, if you're somebody making a film on homeless people and you give them a burrito, what's the difference? You're telling them to do the thing and you're feeding them, but he's
Right. Wasn't this
barbarian.
wasn't this part of the kind of reappraisal of Flaherty too? Right. Like
Yeah,
he played.
exactly.
Right.
But but
Nanook
he but
was not
Herzog,
a so-called primitive, right?
yeah,
He helped Flaherty load the cameras, and he understood
hello.
modern technology and so forth.
Yeah, in Herzog's barbarian, he's up a he that's just part of his culture, how he acts. I've asked him these questions, and anyways, the question we're getting to, anyways, the thing about Wiseman is he actually said my work is reality fiction. So
Uh-huh.
he knows he doesn't like to talk. I reduced my whole 90-minute interview to 5 minutes with her Wiseman in a lobby at USC once, because he answered 3 questions, and I know he doesn't want to talk this out. He wants his film to talk for him. But it's like
Mhm.
you brought up Brackett. Brackett says, let the film speak for itself. Then he'd talk about it for 2 hours. So I'm all for that. I learned from Frank Zappa to embrace contradiction. But I love what you said, because that's a question I ask. Actually, leading into this is Louis Buñuel says, I'm for anyone who seeks the truth, but I part ways when they claim they found it.
Right.
Now,
Right.
99% of people go, that's so true. And I goes, yeah, one person finally challenged me. He says, that's bullshit, because if I'm going to seek something, it's because I want to find it. So then I morphed it into the question, if the journey's more important than the destination, then why do we have to name or seek a destination?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's the way in which we're not just wandering aimlessly, right?
Well, that's the guys who changed the world. The people who changed the world in Paris in the 20s were all flaneurs, or not all, they were flaneurs, psychogeography. Just wander aimlessly and you'll stumble into something like Joyce. You'll have an epiphany in everydayness. I mean,
Mhm.
that's why most people can't take Frederick Wiseman sitting in a shopping mall for 6 hours on PBS.
Right. I mean, and also, I told you I work teaching. One of the places I teach, the main gig is at a community college, and so I deal with, uh, you know, the regular people essentially,
Yeah.
people who are maybe taking the only film class they'll ever take, um, and uh, one of the things I've noticed a lot in terms of their evaluation of movies is that it really bothers them where when the narrative structure of a film, uh, is non-causal,
Yeah.
right? Or if um, the opposite happens, things fit together in a three-act structure, and everything builds and makes sense, and everything's linked causally. Um, they love it,
Yeah.
and part of, I think, bringing consciousness to that is, well, why is it? Why is it that you enjoy so much when the meaning of things fit together like a puzzle, and when things are like closer to they are in real life, where there's a certain indeterminacy and randomness, and your attention is brought to things that actually are not central to the story. The camera moves and looks at something that doesn't mean anything, and is spending a long time on that thing, and then it never comes back and doesn't mean anything to the like that
Yeah.
really, really bothers them, and they say that's bad. They hate it. And so I like to get into, well, why is it that you're putting those values on these things? And that's part
Yeah.
of, I think, understanding the medium.
Yeah. No, you're a good teacher then, because that's why Griffith carried a copy of Dickens around in his back pocket, because all he was doing was filming plays. So what? And that's why Peter Greenaway says Marty's not doing anything different than D.W. Griffith. He's just filming a play. So what? He does better editing or different camera movement or whatever. So it's not to diss either of them, but that's why narrative hijacked cinema. And
Right, and
that's all. That's why.
a particular kind of narrative too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not the shaggy dog story, not the film that wanders and
Yeah.
discovers things randomly, like you're saying, but things that concentrate certain kinds of
Yeah.
meanings.
Yeah. Because it's what we're going to get into this about 4 or 5 questions down the line, but it's what we were trained to believe a film. I grew up with feel good movies and Wizard of Oz and Capra, and that's how I grew up. So that's how their kids are told that when they read books with their parents. They're told this is how a narrative works. And so we're brainwashed to believe that is how, but there's other ways to have narratives, and there's other ways to story tell. So that's what upsets them, because it's not in their norm of what the culture has taught them. But Greg, walk us through, where did you get to this point? What's your tipping point to say, I want to be a filmmaker? And then specifically experimental. Were they hand in hand, or, are your parents showing you films on VHS or DVD, or taking you
No,
to movie theaters?
no.
I mean, would you study in high school and college? Where's that tipping point? And you go, that's my calling, filmmaking and educator.
My parents were both scientists, and we're not uh, sort of that culturally fluent in things that in things like film or literature and so forth. Um, and maybe what I became interested in. It's hard to say. Some people say that uh, people's attitudes is sort of inborn. People's um, if you're kind of like a mutant, then that's just part of who you are. I'd like to think that I've made a choice. I've made choices as to what I feel is necessary or what I want to do, and that's why I chose experimental film. It is something that I think is interesting, and it's a way of working that I think is interesting. Particularly the idea that you could look at cinema uh, as an art form. And what I mean by that is, look at it from the perspective of how someone else, an individual artist in the arts, plastic arts, whatever you want to call it, painting, sculpture, those kinds of traditions, where an individual is the primary mover and shaker of a work. That's the kind of filmmaking that I've always enjoyed, been involved in. Um, it doesn't mean that I don't watch all kinds of things, from the most banal, from I enjoy pretty, bad movies too, bad television, whatever. I'll consume it all. But the thing that I find the most interesting to me and have been involved with the most has been experimental film over the years, and certainly in terms of my filmmaking and uh, video making. Um, I find that that's an exciting area. I also think that it's related to the contemporary art movements. You can link a lot of what went on in experimental film in the 1960s, 1970s, 1950s, and onward, 80s, uh, to contemporaneous art movements. And in fact, in many cases, the art movements were doing some of these things first. But as Tony Conrad said, that the experimental film has had a scrappy integrity that perhaps the art world doesn't have because of its dependence on the rich collector.
Totally. I'm a huge hero of Tony, and I'm sure you've seen that documentary on him. The other line, if you haven't seen it, you got to see it. The other line I love Tony said is, artists break rules that haven't even been made yet. But Greg, I mean, are you growing up in high school and college making your own films? Where was that tipping point where you go, oh, that's what I want to do? Because or did you, am I saying it wrong? Did you get into filmmaking from the point experimental film on? Did you make just films before you got into experimental film?
No.
What'd you study in high school and college?
In high school, I was interested in drawing and painting and sculpture. And then I started taking those courses in college, but there was nothing special about what was going on in those places. It's not that I had bad
Yeah.
teachers in college, and they were fine, and one of them I'm still in touch with in terms in who taught painting. But what I saw going on in cinema was seemingly much more special.
Yeah.
And it drew me into cinema, I think, because of that. So in some ways, it was my choice to go into it, but it's also happenstance that I happened to run into, Gottheim and Jacobs, and in some ways, like, I was first impressed by Ken as somebody who did break rules, and who is this guy who's not an academic at all, in an academic context.
Yeah.
And it turned out that he had never even, gone to college or anything like
Yeah.
that himself. And anyway, the sort of rebellious aspect of that sort of attracted me. But also, really, the films that he was presenting seemed, like there were things I'd never seen before, and they were shocking and fascinating and boring and all kinds of things.
No,
Um,
Ken, one thing I love, Ken said once at a public screening in LA, they go, how'd you do that? And he goes, I'm not telling you. That was so classic. But let's go back then. What's your tipping point to pursue drawing, painting, and sculpture? Did your parents take you to art museums? Where's that tipping point where you said, that's what I want to pursue? Like, your parents are scientists, you chose painting, sculpture, and drawing for some reason. What was that tipping point? You saw some art and go, that's what I want to do?
No, not really. I think it was just at first it was just sort of this sketching and doodling and noodling. um, you
From
know,
comic books? Did you grow up looking at comic books or
yeah, I liked Mad Magazine,
yeah,
and stuff like that. So I did, yeah, like cartoons were something that interested me.
yeah,
I grew up on Warner Brothers cartoons, basically.
yeah,
Um, and then later I realized how serious, and how great like Chuck Jones's work was.
yeah,
Um, and But in any case, so I think a lot of it came out of sort of drawing cartoons or something. And then when I got to college, I took it more seriously and became more aware of art museums, and things
yeah,
like that. I don't know that uh, I had seen things like, let's say, Un Chien Andalou or
yeah,
something like that in high school, when I was a teenager. But I don't know what I thought of it.
yeah,
I was sort of like dumbfounded by it, I guess.
yeah,
And it wasn't until later that it became sort of really interesting to me. I don't know that I was ready for it as a teenager.
yeah. Yeah, that's heavy. So then, Ken and Larry sort of opened it up the door and then you pursued it. Now, you've made experimental film and video for many years. A screenwriting teacher told me great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says the opposite. Great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process when you're making a film or a video?
Well, it depends on the individual piece, but I would say that one thing that I was doing for a long period of time were these kind of computational remixes of Hollywood movies.
Yeah,
Those are the ones that have shown around at various museums and festivals and things, more than anything else. Mine anyway, and those things. I come back to this quote from Saul LeWitt about conceptual art, who said, conceptual artists are mystics, rather than rationalists. And I think that's probably true of what I was doing there with that stuff too. I would take sections of these classical films and then put them through some kind of computational pacing, and then something would come out. But I don't know that what came out was exactly what I intended, and very often it wasn't. Sometimes it was not as good as what I would thought it would be, and sometimes it would be better. But in any case, there's a certain kind of shamanistic quality to that, in which things happen that you didn't necessarily intend, and that's fine.
yeah. Couple questions in that regard. Computational meaning you were using digital editing or you were editing with 16 millimeter on these remixes.
On the remixes, they're all digital.
Yeah,
So they started around 2000 or 1999 or something, and I, up until the present, I'm still sort of working on various
yeah,
things like that. But in any
uh,
case, but that doesn't mean that they're the compositional ideas that structure them are uh, only in the computer. Very often, I sketch them out on a piece of paper first, um, so that and then sort of come up with a computer. How do I create that structure in the computer is another problem. But I start out with, let's say, some simple compositional idea, that it's a global idea often. In other words, it is one idea that structures everything in it, in the piece. Um,
I'm
if that makes
curious if
sense.
that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious if you had seen some other experimental filmmakers do the remixy kind of idea before you, that kind of had an impact on you? I'm thinking
Well,
of two films. I'm
very,
thinking of two names, but I'd rather you tell me the names that you, if you saw any before that.
well, one of the things that was shown to me many, many times, both when I was in Binghamton as a student, and then I was in San Francisco with um, various people, including, Carolee Schneeman was there, and Ernie Gare was there, and George Kuchar, and Larry Jordan, and et cetera, on and on. So I've met like a lot of the major 1960s,
Yeah,
70s filmmakers at SFAI, which is no longer in existence, but in any
yeah,
case was a big hub for the experimental film community for many, many years.
yeah,
Um, and so obviously, Bruce Conner was somebody whose work I was very,
yeah,
very familiar with. I'd seen all of his films basically. Um, that's one of the filmmakers that impressed me, who I personally didn't know. Obviously, I knew people like Ernie and so forth because I was
yeah.
in their environment there. Um,
Wait, just a second. You said Carolyn Schleeman, Ernie. Then you said one I didn't get, and then you said Larry Jordan. Who was the third one you said?
oh,
Do you
George Kuchar was there.
Oh,
Uh,
George Kuchar. Yeah. Now, how about a couple others? I'm just curious. Did you see Martin Arnold?
yes, I've seen his work. In fact, I've shown with
Pre
Martin.
pre 1999, pre you doing remixes, you saw Martin Arnold?
Yes,
Yeah.
I had seen. I can't remember what film, but it was probably Peace Touche. Was it
Yeah.
Peace Touche or something?
Yeah.
Um, I can't remember where. I think it might have been in Chicago at a film festival or something like
Yeah.
that.
And then I
Uh,
imagine being in San Francisco, you saw Craig Baldwin's work.
yeah, and I'd met Craig
Yeah.
there. I don't know if he remembers me or not. I remember he showed up to a show that I did at ATA and spent most of his time walking around during the screening or instead of
Oh,
watching the film.
he can't. He's a strange bird, but he's a great filmmaker. In fact, did you see the book about him that just came out?
I've seen it. I haven't gotten it, but yeah,
It's
I
an
have seen it.
amazing book. Yeah. But I was curious. Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your viewer when you're making your film?
Oh, I agree with Duchamp, or should I say, Duchamp agrees with me. um, yeah, I mean, I'm always thinking about what someone's experience of what I'm presenting is going to be. How does this set of uh, materials interact with the human mind?
Yeah.
And also thinking about it from the point of view of someone from our culture too. I mean, generally. So one time somebody asked me when I did a whole bunch of these computational. I think I did a show at Anthology Film Archives of these remix films, and somebody in the audience asked me whether if an alien came down from outer space and didn't know any of the films that I had drawn from, had never seen The Sound of Music, had never seen Singing in the Rain, or Casablanca or anything else, what they would think of this. Um, and I would say they could still watch it, but like these films are probably, richer for people who from our culture who have some awareness of where uh, the material comes from, because of the idea of collage, or of appropriation, stems from the idea that you're questioning the autonomy and unity of artworks in themselves. And so these things are part of a conversation, they're relating to each other. And so the idea that an alien comes down and is experiencing shadows moving around as patterns on the screen, like, yes, you can enjoy just that. And in fact, you might say that some of the work that I've done, stresses the visual, patterns of light on a screen and
Yeah.
so forth, over the content. But understanding the where the images come from is important too, I think, to some
Yeah.
degree.
Did you see that remix of Wizard of Oz where the guy put it in order of the word? It's a 90, it's a feature. It's really worth seeing, but it drives people nuts. I love to show it. But
I haven't seen it. No.
oh, it is, it's mind-blowing. I mean, it's because, especially if you're raised like I was, we watch Wizard of Oz every year as a ritual. And so we know how the whole, I mean, it was like pre people, why did people ever start watching films more than once? I mean, it was when TV came in,
Hmm.
and then when Harold and Maude and King of Hearts came in, they would see it in movie theaters. Now kids are raised with fucking Star Wars and Harry Potter, and that's all they watch for fucking years over and over, you know. So it's an interesting phenomenon. It's like returning to a book. Do you ever read a book over? Well, some people have some books that they can read over and over, but movies, it's like, hey, once is enough for me. But sometimes, like watching it again, like you've done it, is, like you said, a richer experience. I don't need to watch Wizard of Oz again. When I saw it in college on the big screen and had never seen it on the big screen, I just watch it every year. I knew when every television commercial break was.
Hmm.
It's like automatically my body meant, oh, now I go up and get a sandwich. Like, so, Greg, this has been really enlightening. I appreciate it. We got about 10 more minutes and
Sure.
haven't covered but barely a third. Um, McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness, or he calls it a human sensorium. Like knife and fork extends our teeth. The shutter in a camera, or maybe an extension of our eyelid, or the shutter in a projector. Even maybe non-tangible like religion or philosophy is an extension of consciousness. What does the moving image camera extend for you? What humanness? Whether it's the video or film.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea. The idea of kind of prosthesis, right? That
Yeah,
um, one of the things that I always teach students, vis-a-vis the difference between theater and cinema, is that cinema can jump from place to place, from time to time. And so, in some ways, one of the interesting things about cinema as a prosthesis is that, generally as human beings, we're stuck in one direction. We're going from, uh, being born to dying. All of us are, right? And we're stuck in this continuum of uh, time. Although certainly sometimes within that we're not conscious, and we're asleep or we're in a coma or what have you. Um, and
literally.
right, yeah. Um, but essentially, we're stuck in this linear progression.
Yeah,
And in cinema, we're not, right. We can go backwards in
yeah,
time. We can have a flashback. We can jump suddenly, instantly from place to place. That's a kind of prosthesis, right? I suppose that's a kind of extension.
yeah. It's really good. I've never had that answer. Most people say, oh, cinema's extension of the eye or memory. McLuhan also had a funny one. He said it extends your foot because you're traveling.
Uh-huh. Well, in some ways, that's the jumping from place to place, right?
It is. It's like
Yeah.
a magic carpet ride. So McLuhan also said there's no such thing as a good or bad movie. It's a good or bad viewing experience. Any comment?
Well, you're getting into evaluation. So, for example, do I think that there's a kind of hierarchy of greatness out there in the universe. I mean, if you took the Mona Lisa and just put it into outer space and put it in some other universe, or other galaxy, it doesn't mean anything. It's lost.
Yeah.
Its meaning is its relation to people and so forth.
Yeah.
And so, whether or not it's good within some kind of universal context, I would say there is no good film or bad film in that
Exactly.
way. Uh, you know, I remember discussing this once with Tony Conrad. The idea that that there might be a reason to think that some terrible film is good in this particular circumstances because it's doing something for me at a particular moment that I need, right?
Yeah.
And that might be one of the worst films ever made, and but maybe it relaxed me in a moment of crisis for a while, and so that makes it good. And remember that what we began with was for what, right? What's the best thing for humans, for what,
Yeah.
in what situation? And so I would say the same thing about the movies. One argument I always had with the critic Fred Camper is that he has a very fixed idea of what the great filmmakers are and what the great films are. And of course, I'm not one of them, by the way. um,
I've asked him all these same questions, by the way.
uh,
we should go back and listen to that. Yeah, that's funny. Yeah, because that's the critic's job, is they're supposed to say this. Same with curators. They're like, oh, you didn't accept my film because it sucks, right? You're going to tell me it sucks. I would, as a curator, I would go, we can't work it into the program right now. They don't give me that bullshit. Just tell me it sucks.
right, yeah. And
And
so,
we're in the medium that there is no sucky. All experimental films suck. That's the whole point. But you know what I mean. It's there's a wider range of how do you form in the aesthetic, because this is a question I'm dying to ask you. I started asking this 5 years ago to all the hotshot experimental filmmakers in Ann Arbor, and they're all teachers. So are your kids making films with computers? And they're like, no, not. I says, could you tell if they did? Now, I mean, you named it. Is that program you named earlier, Mid Journey? Is that like a film program like DALL-E? It makes
yes,
film.
yeah,
It's the film program. Yeah, I need that. I
it's
mean,
an image. It's an image generator,
so
like DALL-E. It's the same
right.
kind of thing.
So if you put in Martin Arnold meets Greg Biermann at Ken Jacobs barbecue party, and throw a little Abel Gance in there, and it makes a film, and you enter it in Ann Arbor and it wins, are you obliged to tell them a computer made this?
I
You
think
know,
that's fascinating. Yeah, that's
yeah, big fucking deal. That's and the other thing I want to say was Ann Arbor wouldn't accept video for 40 years. They're over 60 years now.
mhm.
And everybody's like, you gotta accept video. Everybody's using it. And we want to stay true to 16 millimeter. It's like, get over it. Bruce Conner entered in the first 5 years a film that he filmed off his TV set.
Mhm.
What's the difference? Whether you film it off your TV set or you actually enter videotape, what's the difference? I mean, I know that it's like, anyways, I want to ask a couple more questions here, Greg, but I don't know. I asked for 90. Can you go a little longer now?
Sure.
Okay, like 10 or 15 minutes or 30 minutes. Just give me a ballpark.
Yeah, let's do 15 more minutes.
Okay, let's do 15 more minutes, but I would like to propose we do another part 2 in 6 months down the line, or 8 months down the line, because I really only got to a third of the questions, but I'm glad you're willing to go 15 more. So Peter Greenaway said, which I said earlier, cinema is much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers. Are experimental filmmakers telling stories in a different way or doing something completely different? I know it's not a good question, but you sort of get the idea from the examples. Me and you can watch Tony Conrad's The Flicker and have a story go through our heads, but it's not storytelling per se.
Right. Yeah.
So
So it
any yeah,
depends on the filmmaking,
yeah,
right? Like if you're thinking about films that are related to surrealism,
yeah,
whether you're talking about Maya Deren or the Brothers Quay or Stacey
yeah,
Steers, all and by the way, not all of those people would say they're surrealists. I think the Brothers Quay would, Darren, and I'm not sure about Stacey, but I see all of them as part of a certain kind of tradition in which there is some kind of narrative, something happening. There's
yeah,
some kind of uh, some kind of environmental story space at least going on,
yeah,
whereas something completely abstract like the flicker, uh, isn't telling a story at all. Not even in a poetic sense, like the so-called film poems. Uh, you know, like Meshes of the Afternoon or something like that,
yeah,
would be doing.
yeah. It's funny because Andrew Noren said, if you put one frame after another, that is narrative, that is storytelling. So even if it's gobbledygook next to gobbledygook or face and close up, it's still storytelling because it's narrative linear. But Hollis Frampton nailed it. He said, narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because we're waiting to die.
Mhm.
Can you forget to die?
Well, as I mentioned, it's in the back of my mind a lot more than it used to be. And so, the thing I've been working on for the last 2 years has been uh, a film about this subject, a kind of
Yeah,
animated, I don't know, personal documentary. I don't even know how to describe it, but it involves a kind of pseudo philosophizing about death and thinking about my own experience having died and come back, that sort of thing. So it's always in the back of my mind, no matter what I'm doing, whether I'm uh, watching a movie or playing tennis or walking down the street, or cooking dinner. Doesn't matter. Somehow that the thought of the end is always there. This idea of conclusion is something that is occupying me a lot more over the past few years. And it's interesting also, I was thinking about the idea that conclusion can mean the end, but it also means that you've come up with you've figured something out. You've come up with an idea that's discovery, is conclusion too, is a conclusion.
yeah. But pre your coma, how do you think you would have asked that? If I asked you that before, can you forget to die? Pre your coma, what do you kind of feel you might have said?
I would probably have been thinking about the idea that uh, I have a lot more time left, and it's not even something I that enters my everyday thought.
Yeah,
It's the idea that you could be doing something for the last time does affect how you approach things in life, I think.
yeah,
And so if I'm cooking dinner, like these days, I'm really trying to make the very very best thing I can make, um, because it might be the last one. Whereas before, I might have just stuffed something down my throat because I just needed to get on to the next thing, or whatever. So I think my attitude has changed a little bit.
yeah. Greg, I'm glad you brought this up and told me about your coma. It's amazing, and I wish you luck on your film. I can't wait to see it because we're making a film right now about archiving, and it really is about death in a lot of ways. And the word archive comes from 1400s, means keep safe, free from harm. Then in
Mhm.
1600s, the etymological roots said records or documents preserved as evidence. And it's based in Greek town hall, public building, archon, archon. But the basic question is it more innate or more invented to archive? And what are you going to do? What plans do you have for your archives? But I'm going to set it up in regards to this death thing. Is you learn from studying Eastern philosophies, be here now, live in the
Mhm.
moment.
Right.
Wyndham Lewis says, the artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future. And the Egyptians would put stuff in their coffin with them when they died. You know, well, why do we feel this need to archive when the whole point is to live in the moment? And is this need or want to archive more innate or more invented?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, I'm involved in archiving projects also because I'm on the board. Right now, I'm the board secretary of the Filmmakers Cooperative, which is
Yeah.
one of the oldest experimental film organizations for distributing experimental films in the world. And
Yes.
you know, preserving, keeping safe these things is a big part of the mission, even after the members have died. And I see things in various states of decay, and one could say, well, we'll move over for the next, filmmaker, and forget about these old things. But I think they do have something to offer people in the moments that they are looking at them now. And so when we restore something and present it to a new audience, that it can be uh, something in the moment for them that's worth seeing.
It's amazing. Because I'm a fan of, you talked about art movements. I'm a fan of the futurists. And they said, destroy all museums and libraries. And like, I live in the library. I go to the library every day, but I love the idea that the futurists thought that up.
Hmm.
So do you think this need or want to archive is more innate in humans or more invented?
I don't know. That's a good question. I can only say for me, um, that it's a worthwhile the projects that I've been working on through the film co-op have been worthwhile, and I'm proud of the things that we restore and distribute, and uh, keeping alive certain experiences that could be very easily lost, because one of the things about, I mean, we're all writing in the sand, obviously. The earth is going to be swallowed up by the sun eventually, and every aspect of human existence with it, probably, more than likely, assuming we don't, find another place to live somewhere else in the galaxy. But assuming that doesn't happen, uh, you know, it's all gone anyway, right? All is vanity. But that's at a scale that's too terrible to think about. And so, in the scale that we live in, um, we have a choice about how long some of these things can exist, and certainly with the digital technologies, we can have many more people see and have access to these things than they ever did before. And so part of it is the digitize. Part of the project that we've been involved with is the digitizing of classic experimental films and contemporary experimental films too, which allows people who are not in New York or Los Angeles or Chicago or San Francisco to see things that they would have never been able to have access to before. And that's great for film studies, but it's just great for the culture at large, right? And so,
Yeah, it's true.
in that scale of things, I think these preservation things are really important.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. But the archivist rule is don't destroy the masters just because you dumped it over to digital. That's the other big thing. Well, we don't have room to store this. So the big question is, do you have plans for your own archive?
Well, most of my digital stuff is in the co-op collection. We have,
But a digital means that this is what a major archivist in LA told me. Digital means you got it on a hard drive and you have to check the hard drive every year and you got to replace the hard drive every 7 years. Do you follow that rule?
yeah, we have what we have are network cloud-based storage devices. That so it's not like that things are on a hard drive on a shelf. That these things are sets of hard drives that are linked together. So if one of them goes down, the information is still there on the other ones.
Good.
There's a certain amount of duplication, in other words, and that's happened before, by the way. That some of our drives do go down, and then we just pop out the drive and stick another one in the spot, and essentially, unless
Hey,
if a bunch of them go down at the same time, which could happen, then that's difficult. One of the things I'm looking into are tape-based storage situations where you can leave the tapes on a shelf for long periods of time. And I've talked to various other organizations that have done these archival projects, and what they do is they save everything out as MJPEG stacks, uh, I'm sorry, JPEG 2000 stacks. Um, in other words, stacks of individual images on these tapes, which then can be reconstructed back into the films if necessary later on. It's a long process, but that's the most stable situation for digital archiving that we don't have yet at the co-op, but I'm hoping, eventually, if we can get the funding together, we would do that too. But right now, we have to do what you're talking about, which is constantly check to make sure that everything is backed up, and that the idea that it's not that the hard drives are they might fail, they will fail. And so the
yeah,
question, so we have to constantly reinvest in
yeah.
copying everything over and over again onto new units. And we have a whole bunch of them now. We have a whole bunch of these storage devices, which each have multiple stacks of hard drives in them, and they duplicate this. They duplicate the same material on a bunch of them, so that if the worst happens, at least we still have a copy on the other device. Um, so yeah, these are complicated archival issues for sure.
Yeah, you really taught me a lot there, Greg. I appreciate it. And I'm curious, do you think archive.org, YouTube, and more important, the net will ever be just turned off?
Well, it's possible. It's possible. I
What's
mean,
your percentage possible? Like 50%? Not
I don't know the
likely.
science, but the electromagnetic pulse that wipes out all computers, uh, you know, coming out of the sun or something. It's possible. I think that all digital technology, uh, whatever's in your bank account or whatever debts you have would be wiped out. That would be kind of amazing in a way.
I heard archive.org changed their home address, not their physical location, one of their addresses to Canada as soon as Trump got in. So
Uh-huh.
that, because archive.org is controversial, but it's an amazing source, just like Ubi Web, what an amazing source. We didn't grow up with a button where we could watch any experimental film in the world. You
Hmm.
know, it's pretty amazing that these things exist.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then sometimes you might say, I've seen versions of those films that look terrible. I've seen like Serene Velocity or something, but that's not the experience of Serene Velocity, because it's certainly
Right.
nothing that the artist would approve of.
Right.
But in any case, that's, you can't fight it. That's just the way it's going to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Greg, it's really been enlightening, and I really appreciate your time and energy, and I learned a lot, and I appreciate your films and your videos. Thank you so much. And I'll send you some dates, and maybe we could book a part 2 down the line, 6
Okay.
months. But there's a lot
Yeah.
more. There's a lot more we can get into. I mean, like I said, I only got through hardly a third of the film questions, so we can get deeper into film and video.
Okay.
And education, being an educator.
Happy to
Yeah.
do it. Thanks, Gerry.
Thank you so much.
Talk to you.
All right.
Bye bye.
Bye.